Welcome to our presentation, The Secret Role of Plankton, where we'll be exploring some of the key aspects of plankton in our waterways. We chose to break our presentation into two parts. I'm Karina and I'll be starting off with an introduction and overview of our topic and the role it plays in science and science in society. Then Daniel will finish off with some specific studies and scientific methods. Firstly, I'd like to address the question, what is science? I was looking for a quote that accurately depicted the multifaceted nature of science, and I came across this one by Carl Sagan. Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe. It really hit the nail on the head for me, as it encompasses the knowledge science produces and the role of science as a process of questioning the world around us. I also loved the use of the phrase skeptically interrogating, to highlight the methodical and systematic nature of that process, that there's a set of rules and regulations. Getting into the heart of the topic, plankton. What are they? They are small, mostly single-celled organisms falling into two broad categories, plants, or phytoplankton, and animals, or zooplankton. Where are they found? They're found in all aquatic environments, and phytoplankton, like land plants, rely on sunlight, and are therefore found in shallow surface waters. The zooplankton rely on the phytoplankton as a food source, and they're found in the same area, the shallow surface waters. Why are they important? Why is this interesting? They have a global significance, playing two primary roles, both in the aquatic food web and photosynthesis, two major ecological processes. How it's come into significance recently is through climate change and how those processes are affected. How are they studied? We'll go into more of this in part B, but we'll briefly touch on the use of technology before Daniel overviews recent studies which focus on climate change and diversity of plankton species. The relevance to science and society. How does science influence society? Mostly we're looking at in this subject is science in context. So we're looking at the certain groups that the field is primarily relevant to, and I've picked out conservation groups, educators, and government. Of course, within each of these groups, you can't leave out or ignore the concept of public engagement. Communication and understanding of mainstream society ultimately leads to action, particularly by these groups, specifically government, the policy makers. Highlighting the global nature and relevance of studying plankton, I conducted a quick search on AuthorMapper to track global research patterns, and you'll notice the widespread results from all around the world. As mentioned previously, it's got global significance, so people all over the world are interested in the results of what their studies might show. If you notice in the top right hand corner, there's significantly more research being done recently, and that's due to that threat of climate change. Two main roles, as I mentioned earlier, the food web and photosynthesis. In the food web, this is an example taken from the subantarctic zone, and it's just generalised, but you'll see the phytoplankton at the bottom in yellow. They're the primary producers, the base of the aquatic food web, and all the energy is then transferred up through the food chain to the larger organisms. The zooplankton in red, they play a primary role as well as primary consumers. They graze on the phytoplankton and then in turn become food for those larger organisms, continuing up the food chain. The role in photosynthesis, similar to that as the trees and plants on land, they use photosynthesis to consume carbon dioxide and release oxygen, which of course we need to breathe. In fact, production of approximately 50% of the world's oxygen can be attributed to plankton, phytoplankton in general. Some of the social and ethical issues, decided to just do a broad overview of scrutiny over the collection of biological specimens for scientific studies in general, with the arguments against including potential harm to species and their numbers, and that alternative recording procedures could be used to the same effect. The arguments for argue that modern collection procedures are strongly regulated to minimise harm, that alternatives are insufficient, and that in the present climate of global change, the benefit outweighs the risk associated. Finally, an example of a type of technology that's been integral in the collection of plankton species, the Continuous Plankton Recorder, or CPR. It's a simple machine that's been in regular operation since 1948, and while analysis procedures have changed significantly over the years, this is still the most successful method of mass data collection of plankton species. Just going over the process, the first step is the sample collection itself. CPR is towed behind merchant ships at 5 to 10 metres depth, which you'll recall is the depth that most of the plankton species are living at in that shallow waters. Excuse me. The water passes through the CPR, plankton are filtered onto a slow-moving band of silk and covered by a second layer of silk to lock them in. The silk is then divided into samples representing 10 nautical miles of tow back in the laboratory. The first element of analysis is the Phytoplankton Colour Index, or PCI, and it's determined for each sample. It's evaluated against a colour chart for greenness, and that's based on the production of green chlorophyll pigments of the phytoplankton. The second form of analysis is the microscopic analysis of each sample, which includes identifying and counting individual phytoplankton and zooplankton species. And since 2011, there's been a global alliance of all CPR surveys that have formed, and it creates a collective database, which essentially pools data so that scientists can collaborate across the globe to understand the effects of the environment on plankton diversity at a global level. I'll pass on to Daniel now for part B, and he'll go over, as I was saying before, some of the specific studies